Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lens on the Water. This is the Globe and Mail Rolex event where we're here to view some amazing images and talk about the ocean. We are a little ways away from the ocean, but there is a beautiful, glorious, majestic lake just down the street. Sometimes we forget that in Toronto, but we should really consider the idea that that lake is a treasure. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who traverse that lake, the Anishinaabe people. There were many names for it. The Haudenosaunee name was Sparkling Water, which I think is pretty appropriate. I'd also like to acknowledge the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Wendat. So we're grateful to be here tonight. We're also grateful to be on this land. I'd also like to acknowledge the two sponsors of tonight, one being the Globe and Mail. A few words about the Globe and Mail. That's where I work. I'm a senior editor at the Globe and Mail. I lead a team of journalists who cover climate, natural resource, and environment issues. If you're not familiar with climate change, you can just step outside for 5 minutes and feel the heat sear your skin. It's nice to be inside, but it's also nice to consider that this isn't the right temperature for June. So we'll get into a bit of those things. We'll think a bit about what's happening, why things are happening this way. We're not going to talk about heat domes per se, but we're going to talk about the ocean and why it's important to save it and conserve it. I'd also like to acknowledge Rolex, who is a co-sponsor with the Globe and Mail. My friend at Rolex, Alexandra, and I had a conversation one winter's day in Toronto about what we could do to highlight some of the beautiful things in our country. And so I think we've succeeded. If you've had a chance to look around at the extraordinary images, the way that they're presented, it really is mind-blowing. And I know Rolex cares about the image, cares about photography. We also at the Globe and Mail care about the image, about photography. We care about protecting it. We care about the idea that the image projects truth. And so before I go too deeply on that, Cristina and I hopefully will get into some of those discussions too. I'd like to introduce the person who will facilitate our first discussion. I am familiar with this person. Her name is Jen Thornhill Verma. She is I would say, a meticulous, curious, very hardworking journalist who I first met while working on a story about cod. She's written a book about cod. We have continued that relationship, and currently Jen is a Pulitzer Fellow working for the Oceans Reporting Network, as well as the Globe and Mail. And we are involved in a very interesting series of stories that I hope perhaps you've seen a couple of them, looking at the plight of the North Atlantic right whale, an endangered species in Canada and the United States, and the measures that need to be put into effect on both sides of the borders to help save those creatures. She also has recently just won a Canadian Association of Journalists Award for her work on a previous story that we collaborated on, looking at the people of Nunatsiavut and how they are confronting the issue of sea ice change directly and head on. And I believe Johnny Lamb is here tonight, who I saw briefly. He was another photographer who took some extraordinary images of the people of Nunatsiavut. So without any further ado, I welcome Jen to the stage.
Thank you, Ryan, for that very nice introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled that this event is focused on ocean conservation. And it's a pleasure that I have an opportunity to sit down with a photojournalist whose work has taken him around the world on a mission of marine and freshwater conservation storytelling. Shane Gross was named the 2024 Adult Grand Title winner of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Award. He's the author of the book Bahamas Underwater, and he's here to share his incredible stories behind the lens. So let's welcome Shane to the stage. Okay, so I'm from Newfoundland, Labrador, which we like to call the rock, but could have just as been easily called the ocean. So you know that the first question I have to ask Shane, who's from Regina, Saskatchewan, not close to any of Canada's 3 bordered oceans, how did you develop a fascination with the sea?
Well, I got lucky in a few ways. First, just being lucky to grow up in Regina. If anybody's from there knows, it's a wonderful little place. But I grew up within an hour of a lake. So I got to grow up snorkeling and fishing in this lake, and I was always much more comfortable in the water than I am on land. I'm kind of like a sea turtle or a seal or a penguin. I'm pretty awkward on land, but get me in the water and I feel much more comfortable. And the other thing was I was obsessed with sharks. Jaws was my favorite movie growing up. I've seen it hundreds of times. I'm wearing a Jaws shirt tonight in commemoration of its 50th anniversary. And I really wanted to be like Matt Hooper in Jaws. In the movie, he actually says that he loves sharks. And I was like, yes, that's my guy. I want to be him. I love sharks, and the rest of the world is stupid and doesn't get it. They're amazing. And that translated into, eventually becoming a scuba instructor, moving to the Bahamas, and slowly finding my passion in underwater photography and seeing how that could be used as a tool for conservation change.
Fantastic. You became a certified scuba diver at 15 and began documenting your underwater adventures by university age. I mean, it's one thing to dive in, it's another to document. And I wonder what inspired you those first few times to bring the camera?
Well, at first it was just, I want to show my family and friends these amazing things that I'm seeing. But it was very, the pictures weren't very good, but they were showing really amazing things. And I was backpacking Australia with some friends and, just getting odd jobs and eking by. And then one day was on a Greyhound bus traveling from one town to another. I can't remember where we were, but the bus pulled over. And I got out, and there was a magazine stand there, and I opened up the magazine, and I saw the most amazing picture that I'd ever seen in my life. It was by Doug Perrine. It was the 2004 Wildlife Photographer of the Year winning image of these 2 sharks bursting through a bait ball of sardines in South Africa, their mouths lined with fish. And I was like, oh my God, I want to be able to take a picture somewhere close to as good as this someday. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to really dedicate myself. And so I went back to Regina. I stayed in my parents' basement, and I went into a bank and I said, I want $10,000 for camera equipment. And they said no. So I said, fine, it's for a car. And they said, well, if it's for a car, then that's fine. We'll give you the loan. And then I went out and bought the camera. And just started shooting.
Yeah, and you also had great instructors. So we're going to cue your first photo, Baby Lemon Shark. And I understand that Baby Lemon Sharks taught you underwater photography.
Yes, if anybody's interested in getting into underwater photography, I recommend finding your own baby lemon shark, because these guys and girls are so cute. They're less than 2 feet long, they're floppy, they're silly, they're clumsy, not what you think of when you think of sharks. And they're in a beautiful environment in these mangroves, and I had access to them now. I was living in the Bahamas, and I could go back to this spot over and over and get to know the sharks. I got to know them on an individual basis. I got to know them by name. They may have even gotten to know me a little bit. And over days, weeks, months, years, we built a relationship, and it was them that kept me going back. It was them that kept me shooting, wanting to try new techniques. They taught me about the ocean and tides and, just all the different factors that go into planning out a shoot and making a successful photograph. So I owe everything to those baby lemon sharks. And that spot that you're looking at now, proud to say, is a marine protected area, partially because of those sharks and mangroves. So thank you, baby lemon sharks.
Great tip. I wanted to ask you about, because you've had this unique opportunity to experience the ocean from so many different places, and the Pulitzer Ocean Reporting Network, which Canada, the Globe and Mail has hosted the first fellowship of the network, which we're really proud of. They've encouraged us to really think about the global ocean. A marine hotspot is the Northwest Atlantic. That's, of course, going to affect the ocean environment in the global ecosystem. With your experiences in Australia, the Bahamas, Canada, what commonalities do you see from behind the camera?
Well, the creatures and the currents, they don't care about our human-made borders. Like one example is humpback whales. We're all familiar with the great whales, and they'll migrate from Antarctica up to French Polynesia, or they'll migrate from Alaska and British Columbia down to Hawaii. So they're crossing, all kinds of temperature gradients and depths and behaviors, and it's I could name a million examples of ocean creatures that do that. But our borders don't matter to them, but they matter to us, and so we need to do what we can to make sure that we are protecting not just what's in our waters, but beyond that. So right now, a big topic of discussion is the Global Ocean Treaty, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. But beyond countries' limits in the ocean, there is still a lot of ocean. And right now, it's completely lawless. People can take whatever they want. There's human atrocities and deaths and slavery and all kinds of awful things going on beyond our borders. And the Global Ocean Treaty is a United Nations event that hopefully will put some rules in place for that, because we desperately need it.
Yeah, it's a good point you mentioned that. A couple of weeks ago at the UN Ocean Conference, I was really fortunate to be there as part of the Pulitzer Ocean Reporting Network Fellowship and saw the treaty. So the UN had brought the treaty to the UN Ocean Conference. I got to see the 18 countries that signed that particular night. And it was important for me to talk to the Canadian delegates, because it's not a question of if Canada will sign the High Seas Treaty, it's when. We had a bit of an eventful, newsy first part of the year that delayed the signing of that, but we're going to continue to report on that. I wanted to, we're bridging into conservation, and it's one thing to kind of get the shot. It's another to think about and further a conservation agenda. So we want to cue your next photo. The seahorse photo is really a prime example of how bringing people to an environment that they otherwise would not have an opportunity to experience can really lend itself to pushing a policy envelope. So talk to us about that image and what's transpired since taking that photo.
Well, the first thing I would say about that photo is that because, hopefully I don't sound like I have too big of a head, but I think it's a good photo. And because it's a good photo, it went far. It saw a lot of eyes, and that helped when it came time to fight for this amazing place. So I want to tell you a little bit about this place. It's called Seahorse National Park now, to give away the ending. But it's this amazing little pond on a little island in the Bahamas that is filled with seahorses and other life, but it's very special for its seahorses. When I first started snorkeling in there was very little known about it. We didn't even know what species of seahorse was in there. And then I met with some scientists, and they did their genetic studies and found out what kind it was. But this is in 2016. We didn't even know what kind was in there. Then that scientist, Dr. Heather Mason, she went on and counted how many seahorses were in there. This is a pond by maybe 1.5 kilometers by 1 kilometer, and she counted 800,000 seahorses in this little pond. It's absolutely incredible. At the time, there was a proposal forward to turn it into a marina. It's blocked off from the ocean right now, but the proposal was to dynamite out the little rock that separated it from the ocean to turn it into a marina. There was also people going in and stealing. Actually, it wasn't even stealing, it was perfectly legal. They were taking seahorses out of the pond to sell for the aquarium trade. And we had this debate, well, do we just try to keep it as secret as possible and hope that these things go away? Or do we do the opposite? Do we make it as big of a deal as we can to try to get it protected? And that's what we decided to do. So using my images and Dr. Heather Mason's science, and we teamed up with all the conservation organizations throughout the Bahamas and beyond to run a campaign to try to get this place protected. And we started local. We went around to all the different schools and gave talks, and using my photos, we showed all the kids what was in there. Those kids went and told their parents, and then we held community meetings and talked with all the parents. And then we went up to the government and met with the Prime Minister of the Bahamas and showed him these pictures. And it took almost 10 years of work, but it is now Seahorse National Park, and it is fully protected. It's a complete no-take zone. And to me, it's just an example that, it takes time and it's hard work, but change can happen. And I believe that photography can be a big tool in that. It can help. It can show people what's there that can't otherwise go. And it reminds me why I do this in the first place, because there are certainly many nights when I go, am I really making any difference? Am I just out there for myself? And is this a selfish act? Sometimes it feels that way. So I think about the seahorses.
So do we think, yes, thank you. Also, do we think it's a pretty good photo? To your earlier point. Thank you for doing that work. It's not enough to do the work, but you're wearing the sandwich board to promote the work. Like that's what that story also tells me. And Cristina, I'm sure, is going to talk about that as well. It's not enough to do the work. You've got to get out there and talk about it. I want to premise this next question with a quote that has just stayed with me from a fifth-generation Newfoundland fisherman, the late Eugene Maloney from Bay Bulls. And he had 3 woodsheds, which in Newfoundland terms, if you have 3 woodsheds, like the ratio of 3 woodsheds to your house is pretty incredible. And in one of those woodsheds, he had scrawled on a piece of plank wood, anyone who go to sea for fun would go to hell for pastime. And it said to me, the sea is at best unpredictable, at worst it's inhospitable, even deadly. How do you navigate those challenges of an unpredictable environment where you work?
Well, anytime that I find myself in a situation that's a bit iffy and I get my ass kicked, it's a good reminder that, oh yeah, we do not belong in the ocean. We can't breathe there. We can't last very long, even if our head's above water, because our temperature will drop too quickly. Even if you're floating on a boat in the middle of the ocean, if you don't have fresh water, you will become dehydrated really quickly. And I always thought that that would be such a horrible way to go, floating in the middle of the ocean, dying of dehydration amongst all this water. So over and over, the ocean reminds you that we do not belong there. We are not made for that environment. And seeing these amazing animals like sea lions and turtles and sharks and just any old fish, they're so well adapted for this place, and we are not. So for me, it's just, I'm a very cautious person by nature, and I think that has done very well for me. I've never broken a bone. I've only had stitches once. I'm a very cautious person, and I am not afraid if I'm driving to the ocean to go for a dive and I look and it's too wavy, I'll turn around and go home, even if I drove hours to get there, because it will absolutely beat you up, and it is not worth it. So if you are into this sort of thing, the ocean can be obviously an amazing place. That's what keeps us going back, but you have to respect it, or it will turn on you and kill you easily.
Well, and I think that's where that phrase on the plank wood came from, because he, after the cod fishery collapsed and, stopped, he hauled up all of his traps and pivoted to boat building. He would still wake up 2, 3 a.m. in the morning, look at the weather, and, wish that he was going out there. So your work really transports people to places, both marine and freshwater. I know we're giving the ocean the attention, but freshwater as well, and we have an example, that they otherwise would not experience, certainly not in that way. And from a conservation perspective. So I wanted to ask you about striking the right balance. We're gonna cue a photo of an entangled sea turtle. But I just want to premise that by saying that, in my reporting, fisheries and oceans, climate change, there has been a shift from stories that solicit fear and anxiety to those that are trying to inspire hope and action. And I think conservation generally is on a similar trajectory where we see like readers are tuning out fear-based narratives at a time when there's a lot of fear-based narratives, unfortunately. And at the same time, and Ryan said this, we've got to show the real world. We've got to show the severity of the situation. So I wanted to ask you, how do you contend with choosing between these stunning images of the natural environment to these painful truths of what we're doing to the environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could easily ask you the same question. Maybe you want to weigh in at the end, your opinion. But for me, it's you need to approach the truth. And the truth is that there is a lot of beauty in the ocean still, but we're doing a lot of atrocious things to it. That is the truth. How do you keep people engaged now becomes the question. And, for that, it's striking the balance. And somewhere in my mind, I'm like 70, 80% positive, 20% harsh truth. A friend of mine did a study as part of her PhD, and she did a clever little experiment. She set up a photo gallery using actually some of my images that showed beautiful pictures and a donation box saying, "Help the ocean." Then she set up a gallery with hard to look at reality images and a donation box saying, "Help the ocean." And then she did a third one that showed both side by side and a donation box saying, "Help the ocean." And the first two got about the same amount of donations. The pretty pictures and the hard to look at pictures got about the same amount. It was the third one that showed the balance of the two that got the most amount of donations. And so to me, I read a lot into that about human behavior, that we need to see both sides and we deserve to see both sides, but we also need to help people to fall in love with the ocean and care about it, and you're going to do that by showing them mostly the beauty. That's my opinion. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think you need both end. I think, to be able to really show the severity of an issue, if you can do that in a way that is, culturally and coastally sensitive to where you are, but also to say, here's people who are doing things differently. This is a future possible. The future is here. It's not yet evenly distributed, but this is what it could look like. Something that works well here, could be scaled. And I think that, with a problem as gnarly as climate change and these conservation issues, there's no one thing you can do. And I think it requires us to do really in-depth reporting. And at the end of the day, I really think about what are we doing that inspires people to learn about, in this case, the Canadian context, and be able to learn from what others are doing. I think we often live in this universe where we think, my situation is so unique. I thought that as a 12-year-old when the cod fishery collapsed. And I thought that couldn't possibly happen elsewhere, but it continued to happen. Could be different species, but I think, those narratives are really important for getting people outside of themselves and also seeing a future possible. We're going to talk about, I wanted to ask you about also, because the creatures, I think anyone seeing the visuals tonight and the photographs, these are such charismatic creatures. And that gives you an opportunity in, I think, the photography and certainly in the writing as well. In the Globes Entangled series that Ryan mentioned, I try to think about for each story in the series, the main character whale energy that we want to bring. And these whales are commonly seen, unfortunately, struck by a ship or entangled in fishing gear. And a couple weeks ago, we had a healthy feeding North Atlantic right whale on the cover of the Globe and Mail. And that was part of trying to think about the hope in action versus fear and paralysis. But what I wanted to ask you, how do you get to know the charismatic creatures you photograph? And it's one thing to do that with a whale, like people want to love whales. It's another to do that with a tadpole. So how do you get to know these charismatic creatures, and how does getting to know them influence your work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree. It's very easy. People already have a very warm and fuzzy feeling when it comes to whales and certain animals. When it comes to sharks or tadpoles or some of the other animals that are maybe not as, classically charismatic, I never I never understood it because I always saw them as interesting and charismatic when I was growing up, and a northern pike in my lake, or a little frog that I caught along the edge, or the snake, or whatever it was, were equally fascinating, and I just wanted to be close to them. And I think that helps in my photography. It's like it's trying to find out what it is about that species or habitat or whatever it is that's special, and they're all special. We can't all be experts on there are millions of species out there. I don't know if everybody even realizes that there's millions of species on this planet. You can't know them all intimately, but for me as a kid, I know when I would go to the school library and I'd take out a book, there were certain pages I would stop on and I would just, wow, look at this fish called a royal grandma. It's half purple and half yellow. Isn't that absolutely amazing? I know that could happen for somebody else, that they could be flipping through a book or watching a documentary or whatever it is, and for some reason, some little fish or amphibian or mammal or whatever it is going to strike them and inspire them to hopefully do something, whether that's become a scientist or a storyteller or whatever it is. So they're all charismatic in their own way, and it's about finding out what it is about them that you can show in as cool of a light as possible.
The other thing you had mentioned, and I want to ask you to elaborate on it more, is this focus on underrepresented species. What drew your interest in that direction?
Well, at first it was quite selfish because I noticed, nobody else is photographing this. So if I photograph it, then it's more likely to sell to a magazine or whatever. But over time, I noticed it as sort of a theme in my work, and I realized that I maybe unconsciously that was myself. I felt like I was constantly being overlooked and passed over and unseen, and I wanted to shine a light on them because I knew how that felt. Not to get too deep on y'all tonight.
You've covered a massive amount of ocean terrain and freshwater systems as well. How do you choose your shooting locations, and what preparation is involved for you in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of what has been done so that I can do what hasn't been done. There's no point in me going and taking the same picture as somebody else over and over again, so I try to find something that's unique. That's the start. And then what's possible? What's close to home? What can I do that's in my backyard? Because then I can go back over and over and over and hopefully try to get something new and interesting, as opposed to flying across the world where, now I only have 1 week to shoot it, and again, you get the same pictures as everybody else. So it really comes down to opportunity for me. I'm not in a position yet where I can just pick on a dartboard, oh, this is really cool, I'm gonna go shoot it. I have to be very strategic, and I think that's helped me to see things that I otherwise might not have. If I had all the money and all the opportunity in the world, I might have overlooked a lot of the amazing things that I've gone on to photograph. So in a way, I'm quite grateful for it.
Yeah. But if you did have a dartboard and you could throw the dart at it, what would be on your bucket list that you just, I don't know if you can tell us.
Well, no, I mean, the list is too long, but to me, there's a whole area of the ocean that's so underexplored that if I ever got the opportunity to go in depth into the deep ocean, well beyond scuba diving depths, down into the deep abyss, hydrothermal vents and those kinds of places, that would be kind of the ultimate for me. A, they're under threat from deep sea mining, and B, there's species that are being discovered all the time, and C, nobody else really gets to go there. It kind of ticks all the boxes you could hope for.
Yeah. What is it that drives you to do this work? I mean, it's so much preparation. It's, to get that one shot. What is it that just keeps you going back and wanting to drive your craft and work further?
I think I'm just weird. I don't know. I honestly don't know why I have made major life sacrifices so that I could do this. It's a lot of fun, and it's, you know, rewarding at times, but it's also, you have to be a little bit crazy, I think, to pursue it at basically cost to everything else in your life. I mean, you know, this is it for me. This is all I do day and night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, is pursue this. So that's not normal.
How, I mean, from here, what can we expect to see in terms of the next scope of work that you're embracing? And I'm curious to know, do you always now, I mean, it is a tremendous thing to be able to show that natural environment, but are you now at a stage in your work where you are interested in furthering a conservation agenda? And so you think about, you know, what is that conservation narrative that I can share in my work? Is that part and parcel of deciding what's next for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it is just taking advantage of opportunities that come my way, but also a big part of it is to look at the gaps and say, okay, what needs a light shined on it right now? Maybe more than anything else. There's a million things that need it, but what can I bring to the table right now? And so when I look to the next few years, so I lived in the Bahamas for about 10 years, and I focused heavily on that country and all the issues that they faced and all the successes that they have celebrated. And I've lived in Canada now again for the last 5 years, and so my focus is going to be largely on Canada. And I think for me, a big part that's been overlooked by a lot of people, not everybody, but by the larger community, are the freshwater ecosystems. So I think I'm going to be spending a lot of times in lakes and rivers and streams and ponds and that whole side of Canada. And it gets me excited to go back to Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. I was just in the deep boreal forest in Ontario last week photographing snapping turtles and freshwater fish, and it was absolutely wonderful. And there's so much amazing things happening there that's I hope I can put it together that that's going to be a big part of my next few years.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here and sharing the behind the lens of your work. Can we all give a round of applause for Shane? You're going to stick around for the networking. So please do take an opportunity to talk to Shane, get to know these charismatic creatures. We'd love to talk with you and find out what brought you to this room. It's amazing to see a room filled up as it is. We're going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass
before you go on, I just wanted to say what a great job has Jen done tonight. Hey, she's so professional, so well prepared. Well done.
Thank you. Very nice. Drinks for everybody. Thank you again. And yeah, nice to meet you on a stage. Like, cool. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We'll pass it over to Ryan and Cristina.
Thank you to Jen and Shane. That was an incredible discussion. I've worked closely with both of them, and I know their commitment to these issues runs deep. It's nice to see it come alive on the stage and have such an extraordinary discussion. The second part of our evening tonight, it gives me some great pleasure to introduce Cristina Mittermeier. Cristina is a globally acclaimed photographer, a marine biologist, and a conservation advocate. She's co-founder of Sea Legacy, an organization focused on transforming environmental storytelling through her lens. She's also a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, and she coined the term conservation photography. These are just a few of her many accomplishments. Please welcome to the stage, Cristina Mittermeier.
Thank you, Ryan. How's everybody doing? It's nice to be in the AC, right?
It is a pleasure to be on stage with you. There's so many ways we could begin, but I think for everybody here and the people who may not be as familiar with you as a person, they may be familiar with you through your images. You are an extraordinary person. I mean, you are a marine biologist and you are a globally acclaimed photographer. Which came first? Like, how did that happen?
I think it starts with being a good human first. I am very North American. I was born in Mexico, and then I immigrated to the United States, and then I met a Canadian boy, and I ended up living in Canada. So first of all, I'm North American, and I'm a very proud new Canadian. That's a choice that I'm grateful for every day, my new country. But I think I started as a conservationist. I started by reading books. Like Shane, I grew up inland in a mountain town in Mexico and didn't have access to the ocean, but I had access to books. My brother had a subscription to National Geographic, and we had pirate books. And so I would devour these stories and the descriptions of the animals and the jungles and the ocean, the sharks, all fascinating to me. So I wanted to go to university and be a marine biologist, and of course my father said, no, you're gonna be an accountant like me. Oh, can you imagine? So I made a compromise. I argued and I enlisted my mother to my cause, and as long as I was going to his alma mater, I could study, some respectable career, so I ended up becoming a biochemical engineer in fisheries. And I thought I was going to go and swim with dolphins and whales, and instead I learned everything about the maximum sustainable yield, how we catch fish. I learned early on about the collapse of the cod fishery, and you read these things and you cannot believe that we're making these mistakes. So I knew from an early on time that I didn't want to be a fisheries biologist. I wanted to save the ocean. And I didn't know how to do it, Ryan. So I started with science, and I became a published author. I spent a lot of time writing scientific literature, collaborating with other very important, petulant scientists. And the thing about writing science is that it's all very important, and yes, we need to keep investing in science, but it's so difficult to translate the findings to a general audience and why it matters. And so I became a photographer by accident. I'm not one of those people who cares about cameras, or my father didn't give me a brownie, none of those things. I shared office space with a photographer, and I could see what he was doing. And, I thought, oh, I'll be a photographer. Easy. Not so easy.
And when you talk about photography, what motivates the work behind the image for you? You are living in Canada now, but you traveled the world. Are there specific issues that you want to bring to the forefront, particularly in Canada, in this day and age?
Very much so, but Canada is part of a global community. I realized early on that photography has a very unique power. When you present somebody with text, whether it's a news article or a scientific paper, we interpret that data in a very analytical way with the left side of our brain. But when you show somebody a photograph, this is a visual language that we all are very used to. And we feel comfortable enough to ask questions, to ask, how did the photographer feel? How did you take that picture? I have photographed in many of the same places as Shane has photographed, and I want people to ask, how did you feel like diving at night with those seahorses? Were you scared? Those are human relatable questions. It's the first step in establishing a dialogue. How can we have a proper debate if we don't ask each other questions? So I realized that photography has that power. My favorite reaction to my photographs is, I had no idea that animals did this, or they live that way, or they're important to us in that way. So that's the magic of photography. And in terms of Canada, God, what a magnificent country we live in. We are so gifted with so many resources. I think Donald Trump knows this. And we can choose to coast and just be lucky that we have all of this stuff, or we can choose to be leaders in this field. And I think we can be an example. And when we think about things like the High Seas Treaty and all the countries that have yet to sign the treaty, people are no longer looking at the United States for leadership, but they're going to be looking at us. And so much of that hinges on public support. So the work that photographers like Shane and I do is galvanize public attention, maybe show you something that you hadn't thought about before. And the next time you read about it, you're like, oh yeah, this is important, I support this. I will be speaking to others, I will be voting for this, I will be purchasing because of this. That's the work.
When we think about your images, maybe we could bring up the first image to the screen. It's a picture of kelp. I mean, speaks to relatability. It also speaks to conservation. Maybe you can tell us a bit about why something like kelp matters as much as all the other images of these beautiful creatures.
Yeah, it's a great question. When we think about the ocean, we often think about it, in terms of the beach. We see ourselves with a Corona on the beach. But the ocean is the most important, the largest, and the most defining ecosystem on planet Earth. If a spaceship came from another galaxy and looked upon Earth, they would, of course say this is an ocean planet, and all of these are ocean creatures. We are terrestrial creatures, and we're very arrogant humans, so we have chosen to define our planet in terrestrial terms, but that's very far from the truth. So how does the ocean, why does it matter? But first of all, it's because it's the ecosystem that allows life to exist on planet Earth, and because it does so much for us, even if we're not aware. So the ocean produces 50%, half of the oxygen we breathe. And the way it does it is it's because it's a living ecosystem. When you go to the beach and you get tumbled by a wave and you take a big gulp of water, you think you're just drinking water, but you're drinking a living broth of microorganisms, both plant and animals. And we don't even know the names of these creatures, but if you were to look at the ocean through a microscope, cyanobacteria, a little creature known as Prochlorococcus, it's probably one of the most important creatures on our planet, because 1/4 of the oxygen we breathe is produced by this tiny creature. We don't know how much there is of it. We know very little about its life cycle or how it depends on other creatures like whales to flourish. This is the engine of planet Earth. This is the generator. These are the pistons. And we don't know, not even how to open the hood to take a look inside. So biomes like kelp, like seagrass meadows, they're just part of this machinery that's absorbing carbon dioxide, as much as 25% of the excess emissions. But for the ocean, we would have already cooked like the proverbial frog. The ocean has absorbed 90% of the excess heat on the atmosphere and planet. And now we can see that it's no longer able to cope. We were in Indonesia 6 months ago. The temperature of the water was 32.5 degrees. Just uncomfortable for a human. Imagine what it's like for a fish. As a result, we're seeing, ecosystems degrade very rapidly. We need to keep the ocean alive.
I mean, I think that story of Indonesia is one about, it brings us to the hard truths of climate change. I mean, Shane and Jen got into a bit of this in the discussion of the image of the sea turtle. One of the most powerful images that you've taken is a picture of a polar bear. Perhaps we could bring that up now. It is singularly the image that has catalyzed climate change and what it means for people around the world. How did it happen? What was the reaction? How did it further your pursuit of these issues?
This was a very accidental thing. This image was taken in Canada, in Lancaster Bay, and when my husband, who's a Canadian photographer, Paul Nicklin, he's getting the Order of Canada tomorrow, so exciting. When he found this animal, he's a polar bear biologist, so he knew that this was a creature in distress, but of course we didn't know why it was in such trouble, and we couldn't have guessed, you cannot ask the bear. But we made a photograph, we made a video, and then we posted it on social media. And, every once in a while, an image just stirs the population, and this photograph went viral. And, first day was really fun when you go viral and people like and share and comment. There's a lot of gratitude. And then it started turning, people started asking questions, and you start realizing, God, people don't know very much about the natural world. That curiosity that drives people like Shane and I is not taught in schools. So people were wondering, why didn't we feed this polar bear? because I had half a sandwich in my backpack, and this creature needs about 40 pounds of seal meat every day. But there was a third day and beyond that really, I'm a very curious person. So when things started getting ugly and we started getting called names and fake news and experts started popping up, people saying polar bears are not in trouble. There's never been more polar bears, than we have now. And you start thinking, how can they be saying things like this? But you have to follow the money. And if you're a good journalist, you realize that there's a very well-funded PR communications machine, and if you follow it all the way, it goes to places like the Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, the fossil fuel industry. And I ask myself, Ryan, where is the funding for the storytelling on the other side of the story? People like us trying to stir the imagination and inform the journalists out there, trying to get a little more real estate in the newspaper, more attention. Like, we need to really scale up our communication efforts. We need 100 of you, 100 of Jen, 100 more of Shane and I, because we're just not making enough of a dent to tell the story right. So this story was very traumatic, the polar bear. If I could go back, I'd hire a PR agency to help us manage it and flip it, but we didn't know any better. We're just photographers.
You kind of are your own PR agency now. If we flip to something that is very close to my heart, when I'm talking to people about climate change and how the Globe and Mail approaches the topic, I always bring up the idea of solutions, because I think being solutions focused is the most important thing that we can do in trying to push a different kind of narrative for climate change and leave people with some hope. Are there countries in the world that you see in your travels that are getting it right, that are doing things the right way, that are furthering conservation measures that would give us some hope in that direction?
That's a great question. I think there's heroes almost everywhere. And it always starts with a handful of people locally that see something that's valuable and they start working on it or advocating. And it requires a village. It's never one person that says, oh, I'm going to protect this, and it becomes protected. It's always a machinery of nonprofits and donors and journalists. And when you get the right mix of people, and it takes all of us really, you can make wonderful things happen. I say to people, I know that we're all tired of signing petitions and sharing and commenting, but I promise you it has such an enormous impact, because when you're able to hand that information to somebody who's empowered to make decisions, they realize, we're working right now with the Minister of the Environment of Mexico. She needs public support in order to bring legislation to the president and say, this is what the people want. They're always concerned that there's a segment of the population that's going to be in opposition, and you have to counter those narratives. So communications, I don't think, has ever been more important, and solutions-oriented. Explaining why doing X or Y is not just good for us, it's not just good for Canada or for our family, it's good for our global family. And it's a difficult story to tell. We have to tell it every day. But there's so many solutions, and brilliant ones too. And the heroes that are implementing them are great characters. So these are fun, great stories to tell.
Some of those solutions come from people like you and I. Some of those solutions existed for thousands of years. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about how Indigenous people figure into all these conversations. You've visited many different Indigenous communities. You live in a part of British Columbia that is where lots of Indigenous people live as well. And so where are the solutions on that side of the equation, and how can we further lever them?
When I started my career as a photographer, a little bit like you, Shane, I didn't know where to point my lens, and I was looking for a way to, distinguish myself from very, very accomplished photographers. I was just a mom and a housewife in Mexico. It was hard to get in, but I realized that the intersection where Indigenous knowledge meets nature is a story that needs more communications, more storytelling, and I focus my lens right there. Because it's not like Indigenous people have some spiritual mumbo jumbo that the rest of us don't. It's that they live by a series of principles and moral values that are very earth-oriented. And it doesn't matter where you go on the planet, there's always the idea of community and collaboration and kinship and philanthropy. And the richest person in the village is not the one that has hoarded the most for himself, it's the person that gives back the most. And I think it's universal that you don't take more than what you need and you use everything you take. I mean, these are simple values, but I think they're so central to being a good human on planet Earth and living within the sustainable means of our planetary boundaries. So I look at Indigenous people as such a source of inspiration and courage, and being an ally to Indigenous efforts to protect nature, or even to regain their sovereignty and their rights, is not an act of charity, it's an act of survival. And so we need to do a lot more than that. I just spoke at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And I said to the leaders, corporate and government leaders there, you guys are the pilots of Spaceship Earth, and you have no idea how to manage the ship. You don't know where the engine is, and you're ruining it. If you're smart, you're gonna add 2 seats to your boardroom, an Indigenous leader on your left and a biologist on your right. Maybe a third one, a photographer. How about that?
I mean, you brought up Davos. I think maybe there are some people in this room who deal with a lot of those board governance issues in the corporate world. I am curious, though, how does a talk at Davos about these issues resonate with world leaders, with the movers and shakers in the business community, and how do you make it resonate? Because they are there to talk about issues that mostly deal with the idea of how do we make the world more economically viable? So how do you get beyond that?
Well, I always start with a simple statement. You cannot make money on a dead planet, so we need to do something. I think about human constructs, ideas that we have just adopted as if they were immovable, like the GDP. This is a human idea. This is a construct that is very, very flawed, because the GDP does not incorporate into the balance sheet of any country the value of nature or the labor of volunteers, even what mothers do at home for their children or whatever it is. So reimagining a GDP that takes less into account profit as a value and human well-being and happiness as a value. Wouldn't that be an awesome idea? And it's already happening in some places. The government of Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, is doing exactly this, just throwing GDP out the door and coming up with a human well-being index, which I think is way more valuable. So when I talk to corporate leaders and government leaders, I lean on vulnerability, on just being a human and being really scared about what's happening and not having, any of the solutions. I'm just a photographer. But, wanting to introduce the curiosity to come up with new and courageous ideas, because that's what's needed, and it's required of all of us. One of the biggest things in my work is people at the end of a talk will say, what can I do? And this is a very valid question. And what I say is, you get up in the morning and you say, I'm gonna wear my invisible superhero suit. In our case, it's a wetsuit. You can wear whatever makes you look good. But just declare yourself a hero for the planet and make a commitment to speak to others about why you care and the things that you're doing in your life and the things that you expect of others. The biggest lesson in an Indigenous community is accountability to each other. We all need each other to survive. And being able to look at somebody in the eyes to say, I am accountable to you and I'm doing my part, is huge.
I think one of your images really speaks to this quite clearly. It's an image of a Wet'suwet'en chief, hereditary chief, who's opposed to the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We are in the middle of discussing major projects. The government is discussing major projects. The provinces are discussing major projects. We've given them a name. They're called nation building projects, and we are trying to get Canada building. Is there a balance that can be achieved there with Indigenous participation, in your view?
Well, it's all in good branding, right? These names are awesome. The truth of the matter is countries like Canada need fossil fuels to grow economically. There's no denying that, and I would not be naive to say we need to shut down fossil fuels. But we need to be thinking about other sources of revenue for our country as well. And I would make a huge investment in the youth of Canada to lead in a technology and energy revolution. We need to train young people to take on a different kind of future. But the other side of the story is just acknowledging, Canada, we have the second largest carbon emission per capita on the planet, right after Saudi. We all own that because our economy depends on fossil fuels. So what can we do in our everyday lives to lessen our carbon footprint? And I'm not an expert on this. Michelle Lee, are you in this audience? Where's Michelle? My friend Michelle Lee, she has a nonprofit that educates people about carbon and our carbon footprint. It's called Clever Carbon, and you can go to her website and you figure out your own carbon footprint and how you can make a difference every day. But I think committing to imagining a different kind of future, even as we're stuck in this one, is critical. And yeah, we need fossil fuels today, but what do we need tomorrow?
We've been very serious up to this point, and I dealing with the big issues as we should, but I'm just so curious about what a day in your life looks like. I mean, I know even to get you here, there were several timetable things that had to align, all the rest of it, but what does a day in your life look like? I mean, I also just want to know, what is it like to capture an image like that, and how do you know that you've got it? I mean, how do you know that, like, is there a moment that you feel like, I got it? I'm looking over at this jellyfish picture, and it's just, you must have known that you had it.
It really is departing from where do you see your work as the end place. And for me, even though I worked for National Geographic a little bit and I photographed for editorial, I think of myself as an artist. And I'm always looking for images that would look beautiful in somebody's living room or in a double spread in a book. And that's what I'm thinking when I'm photographing. So a day in my life is geeking out in my computer and going back in my archives, because I know that if I shot 60 or 80 frames of that, one of them is going to be just the one. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. But being a photographer is a little bit like Forrest Gump, like a box of chocolates. You never know until you actually prepare it and post-production, make it, is it going to be a black and white or not? And then show it to a few people and get their reaction. And sometimes you just hit the nail on the head and you get a beautiful image that travels the world. Most of the time, 99% of the time, you don't. A lot of junk in there.
And what about your foundation? How does that figure into all of this in your work?
So Sea Legacy, it was born when my husband and I were shooting an assignment for National Geographic on the Pacific Blob in 2017. And the temperature of the water from California to Alaska was 4 to 7 degrees warmer than it's supposed to be. So there was a lot of mortality of animals that couldn't find fish because the fish, they sink to deeper, cooler water. So animals like sea lions were starving. But also there was an overabundance of some algae that are, naturally balanced, but when it gets too warm, they overbloom. And they produce toxic substances like domoic acid. When animals eat domoic acid, it has paralysis, full body paralysis. They can't swim, so they wash up on shore. It's a horrific thing to photograph, just thousands and thousands of dead animals. And Paul said to me, we can't keep photographing for a magazine. We have to do more. And so we decided to leave National Geographic at the peak of our career and start a nonprofit organization. And the idea was exactly what Shane was talking about. How do we take our images and our ability to communicate and shine the light on the good news and the heroes and the beautiful solutions that are happening, and also on the horrors and a reminder for everyday people. So that's what Sea Legacy does. We travel around the world finding those amazing stories that are able to inspire, give hope, and be a reminder. And it's a Canadian charity. We're very proud of that. And Kate Bergen here, she manages Sea Legacy. So if you want to know more, ask her.
I'm getting back to the serious stuff. We are in a fight for truth around the world. I mentioned off the top that truth in images is a really important thing to stress at an event like this. These images are not artificial intelligence. They're created by real people who in some cases put their lives on the line or at least spend a lot of time in the water. And I just want to talk a bit about what you're doing to fight against the notion of artificial intelligence in image making.
You know, it's such a threat to the work of any creative. You know, we are being replaced by machines, and the saddest part of it is that we didn't know. So when you started uploading your photos to Facebook and Instagram, the tiny little print said that they could use all of that data to train their robots. So they're using our own work to put us out of business. I think the first defense that we have is our reputation, you know, truthfulness and credibility and being honest about the work. But the second one is we are part of a coalition of photographers that started an app that opts images out of training robots. So you basically embed it with an invisible signature that is entered into the blockchain that says this image is not for training. And we're trying to turn the tap off on, you know, it is horrific. You can ask any of these platforms to make you a photograph in the style of Shane Gross of seahorses, and something quite similar is going to come up. And it's just shocking that it doesn't have your copyright. So we hope that our reputation, you know, gives us the credibility with journalists to use our work, but it is dangerous.
For those of you who are not familiar, Cristina has just released a book titled Hope. It is an extraordinary book, both in size and format, but also in the content. It's a very big, beautiful book. And a lot of the photographs in there are not photographs like these photographs. They're photographs of people, they're photographs of communities. How important are communities to all of this work?
Oh, I think community is everything, and community is going to be the thing that saves us in the end, standing together and solidarity with each other. But for my book, I think when you're a little closer to the realities every day, some days are hard, and some days are harder to just say, how do I keep getting up and showing up in an optimistic, hopeful way to inspire others? And sometimes it's hard. So when the opportunity to publish this book came about, it's a small publishing house in France. And they basically came to me and said, you know, we'll publish the book that you want with the format you want, the paper you want. You know, it's a fancy, beautiful book, but you have to help us raise the money to make it happen. And so we called on my community of followers to pre-purchase Hope and help finance the project. And they gave me a number, and we raised twice as much. So who here was part of Hope, of pre-purchasing the book? Oh, there's one person back there. Well, there were lots of you. Thank you. Because we raised enough money to publish the book and you know, this global distribution. And I wanted to give photographers, especially young photographers who haven't had the chance to publish, a new way of financing their projects. And so it's amazing. So as a thank you, I put the name of everybody who pre-purchased the book in the back pages of Hope because it's community. So thank you.
And when you think about that concept of hope and the work that you do, what drives you, what gives you the hope to continue to pursue these images over and over again? And I guess a little bit about, you know, you talked about the community of people who support you. How important are they to making these things work?
Well, it's a community of all of us. I sometimes feel like I'm talking to a void in social media, and then I meet real people who have gone to my lectures. Who's the lady here earlier that came to listen to me at the Roy Thompson Hall and was telling me how that one lecture changed the way that she purchases food for her family? I was like, wow. I'm glad I was passionate that night. But in terms of hope, I recognize that hope is not a plan. You know, we're not going to get there just by hoping. But God, is it imperative to feel hopeful in order to achieve anything? So for me, the book became a personal life raft. When I feel like I cannot get up anymore, I look at the photographs at the communities that I have the privilege of photographing, the incredible people that I have met in the front lines that are risking their lives to bring these stories. And I think we're like a chorus. We're like singing at church, and everybody's singing, and every once in a while, one of us needs to take a moment and catch our breath. But the music doesn't stop. When you're ready, please rejoin us and we'll all keep singing together because we have no choice but to do this together.
And what is next for you? What's the next big challenge for you? What's coming up in your life that you're excited about?
I think one of the things that I love the most about being a photographer is that it's a forever learning journey. And so when you're a photographer, you have all these summits that you need to achieve in your career. And yes, you want to publish in National Geographic. And yes, you want to be in the Globe and Mail. You want to be, in all these places. For me, now that I have this beautiful book, I want to have a traveling exhibition that allows me to speak to many, many audiences about these things. I think there's something quite magical about being in person with a group of people listening in. And that's what I want to do. In the meantime, I have to keep shooting because that's how I make my living. Paul and I have a reputation for being ocean photographers. We have a unique set of skills that very few people in the world share. But we're also wildlife photographers, so we're spending a lot of time in Africa, finding such inspiring stories of people that are saving baby elephants and protecting, the big tuskers and repatriating rhinos. I think we need all the stories that inspire. And we need to be reminded that Martin Luther King didn't start the speech by saying, "I have a nightmare." He told us what the dream was, and I want my photography to be that reminder.
Do you go back to the images? I mean, you were talking about going through your archives and how important that is to you. Do you go back to those images and think about what the most inspiring part of why you decided to capture that? I'm thinking particularly of the cover image on the book, Hope. It's an extraordinary image of a woman with flowers in her hair. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how that came about.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time photographing wildlife, but the rest of my time I go back to villages that are oftentimes very remote and isolated because I love photographing just the way that indigenous people live. And I have spent quite a bit of time in Africa recently for a couple of reasons. I think climate change is real for us in places like Toronto this afternoon, but for them, it's like a daily life thing, and they don't get the reprieve of a beautiful AC hall. They are living really in tough conditions. I was in South Sudan 6 months ago when USAID was pulling out, and all I could think about is, these poor people are in real trouble. There's no food, there's no water. And so when I'm photographing in places like that, I'm often thinking, how can I give back? How do I make sure that if I'm profiting by selling my photographs, I send money back to these villages? This particular photo you're talking about was taken in the Omo Valley of Ethiopia. People are beautiful. They're just naturally gorgeous. They won the genetic lottery for beauty. And the women, even though they're living in such harsh and poverty-stricken conditions, they make such an effort to be beautiful. And I think, that's us girls everywhere. We just like to make ourselves pretty. So I walked into a market and the women were doing the burden of the hard work. Women, the goats, the children, the market, they carry the firewood. And there's this girl and she's beautifully adorned with a bouquet of, where did she get the flowers in the desert? Who knows? And she was not the only one. A lot of the women were dressed, they have scars, they have body paint, beautiful. And she was so poised when I asked her to take her photograph. She didn't look at me with fear or begging or wanting anything. She was just so composed. And I knew that it was going to be a special photograph. I did know that one was going to be nice. So now, I don't have a way to formally, support these women through a nonprofit. There's no charity work happening. USAID is no longer there. So I just send money with the driver who took me. I'm like, I'm gonna have to trust you. I'm gonna give you a couple of $1,000. Please take some millet, some soap, some medicine, and he does. And I have to trust that it made it to those women.
I mean, that's a beautiful, beautiful story. You did talk a bit about how young people really should be the drivers behind pushing for change around climate, but pushing for change around how we do things. And just in your story about that young woman, do you see hope in what young people are pushing for today?
I think, there's two there's two types of young people. The ones that kind of like checked out and are saying things like, what's the point? We're all going to die anyway, and they don't want to have children, they don't want to be engaged. And then there's a group of really courageous young people that are showing up at the conferences and, you know, raising banners. The Greta Thunbergs of the world, she's not the only one, she's just the most famous one. But these young people are driving a conversation, and it's a passionate conversation that's driven by courage and by fear. They're terrified for their own future. And, you know, I remember 25-year-old me and how irresponsible I was. And I think it's not fair that we as adults burden these children with the weight of the world. You know, how are we going to show up for them? And that's one of the things that, you know, that drives me. I am the parent of 3 young people. I want them to know that I did everything I could.
That's a great message. I mean, here we are in downtown Toronto. It's stinking hot outside. We're talking about these issues that affect oceans, that affect freshwater, that affect the biodiverse places on Earth that we are all amazed by. I'm always amazed at the idea of the ocean. I talked to people today about the ocean and said, what is the thing that you really like about the ocean? Some people say it's the breeze. For me, it's looking out over the vast expanse of the ocean. But when you get into the ocean and get inside and discover that hidden world, that must be amazing.
So amazing. I think that, you know, most of the time I get in the water and I oftentimes see something I have no idea what it is. You know, just like, what is this creature? Is it an egg? Is it a larvae? You know, what does it grow up to be? We know so little about the ocean and how it works. And so little of it has been explored. I think there's been more people in the moon than there have been in the bottom of the ocean. Actually, there's never been a human standing in the deepest part of the ocean. It's, you know, Elon, for all his bravado, has not been able to do it. And so, yes, you know, we look at the ocean and we look at it through a lens of this foreign, mysterious thing, and we don't understand that our very lives and our well-being depends on a living ocean. So I think that's a huge part of the message, just a daily reminder is not just curiosity, like whales and dolphins are amazing, but understanding. And very recently, we have started paying attention to the role that animals play in the carbon cycle. We used to think that it was just plants and photosynthesis and carbon and oxygen. Now we know that creatures like whales play a massive role. And who knew? When a whale feeds, it's, you know, dives deep to, you know, 1-2 kilometers underwater and feeds in very mineral rich water, and then it comes to the surface and it poops. And that poop is fertilizer for the phytoplankton that's creating the photosynthesis, the oxygen, drawing down the carbon, like who knew? And so here we are in the 21st century, and there's countries that are still killing whales for food. And you're like, are we not part all of a global climate treaty? You know, these animals are our allies. And it's amazing when governments like the Kingdom of Tonga just recognize whales and gave them personhood, which is what we need to do in places like Canada. Say they're our fellow passengers on the spaceship. We don't know the role that they play, but they're clearly engineers. So we need to protect them.
We're a long way away from the ocean, but I do want to end on that hopeful note and just to ask you again, for everybody who's here tonight, what's 1 or 2 or 3, half a dozen things that they should be doing after this event in thinking about all the things, all the beautiful creatures, all the beauty that we've inspired people with here tonight? What should they be thinking about? What should they be doing to help?
So on the very, very practical side of things, if you don't eat carnivores on land, so you don't eat tigers and lions, and you know why? Because they're very difficult to grow. You know, we don't see them in the grocery store. Then why do we eat carnivores in the ocean? Why do we feel that it's okay to eat tuna or octopus or salmon? You know, these are animals that take up a lot of energy. So pick your herbivores if you're going to eat flesh, and that's a practical thing that we all can do. And just eat more of the herbivores and less of the meat eaters. But on a more philosophical side of things, I think one of the reasons that climate and biodiversity laws are so in the losing side is just funding. the difficulty of raising money for the people that are doing the solutions. Every nonprofit that I talk to is struggling for money. And so in the next 10 years, if we want to stay on this planet, please look at your portfolio of philanthropy. And I don't care if it's elephants or penguins or tadpoles, donate generously to biodiversity because our life depends on it and they all need it. So just find one nonprofit that you love and give with both hands and with your heart wide open.
Thank you very much, Cristina. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I have a few housekeeping things that I will need to discuss, but once again, Cristina Mittermeier, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I say something? I am now Canadian, but as a soon-to-be ex-American, I just want to say thank you to all the Canadians that stood up against this madness. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you.
That's all me. So a big thank you to everybody who came tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in virtually across the country for this event. There was a lot of work behind this event, and I need to thank a few people, particularly at the Globe and Mail, for their work tonight, particularly for the photo exhibit. Deb Bass for video production, Claire, the wonderful Claire Vandermeesch for her photo curation, which was extraordinary. Dominic Macri for the program design, and Murat at Saman Designs for the prints, which are really, really beautiful. And of course, a big thank you to Rolex for all that they have done over these years to help support our work at the Globe and Mail around climate change and climate change solutions. We also would encourage you to provide some feedback on this event. There's a couple of ways to do that. You can complete a brief survey, and you will receive something in your email box. For those who are tuning in virtually, you can use the QR code on the screen. So finally, for those who are still here with us, I would encourage you to stick around, look at the photographs, have some food, have some drinks, chat. Let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much.